media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and we're going to be covering a number of different topics, as you might imagine. A little bit later, we're going to be talking with Jenny Lind Schmit. She is the author of a very good piece that was the cover story for World Magazine, Can Classical Liberalism Be Saved? And that was a commentary I did on July 17th. By the way, I might mention my commentary today, Why the West Won, also gets into some of that. So that will be a conversation we'll have in about a half an hour. Next hour, Adam Kissell will be with us, and he is an individual that works with the Heritage Foundation and is talking about what's happening in this area of higher education, and it's very encouraging, so I think you will appreciate that conversation as well. But I might also mention that tomorrow we have June Hunt in studio. We have later in the week Colonel Alan West. We have Heather McDonald. It's going to be a great week, so I hope that you will join us every day here on Point of View. And I thought I would start out with something that sounds negative, but it's a good illustration of what we talk about so often here on Point of View. Maybe you need to dig a little deeper. The title of this particular editorial is The Trump Economy Stumbles. Now, there were some good reasons why I thought it might be appropriate to deal with this. One, because this is a piece in the Wall Street Journal, and they have, to put it mildly, been very critical of Donald Trump, in particular the tariffs. It is also something that resulted in some really good commentary on Friday by our good friend Gary Bauer. So I want to get into that. And of course, also then, because this has to do with the jobs report, there was a decision made by President Trump to actually fire the individual who is the head of Bureau of Labor Statistics, which some people have said is a good example of firing the messenger. So it went from being a little bit of an obscure kind of issue to something I thought would be appropriate. I'm not surprised that the jobs report was lower for a couple of reasons. First of all, we have, of course, the tariffs. I think they do have some impact. And also deportations. Some people say, well, are you really saying that the people being deported actually had full-time jobs and that's affecting the jobs report? Well, maybe a little bit, but I would recommend, and I can't prove this to you, but I would recommend and suggest that for every person being deported, there are 2 or 3 people saying, I may not want to go out and work today because I might be deported myself. And so it's not just the people being removed, it's also maybe the fear of some who would have actually had those jobs. So we're going to get into the jobs report, and if you know anything about Point of View, we don't talk about it very often. Sometimes on a Friday, Dr. Merrill Matthews sometimes will bring it up. Partially I don't, because it's sort of into the deep weeds. Most people say, I really don't care about the jobs report. As long as I got a job, I really don't care that much. Second of all, it gets into one of my themes, and that is I think sometimes presidents get too much blame for a bad jobs report, and they take entirely too much credit for a good jobs report, because there's only so much a president can do. And then another reason, and I think you'll find this out as we get into this, I think some of these government statistics are inaccurate. But let's go to the first article. You can read it for yourself. It comes from the editors of the Wall Street Journal, that Friday's labor report that came out just this last Friday arrived with a particular jolt, they say, a mere 73,000 net new jobs in July. Even more bearish was the downward revisions of 258,000 jobs in May and June, because they had overestimated those rather significantly. And the argument they make, and I think it's true, is employers aren't laying off workers, but they've all but stopped hiring new workers. Okay, that makes some sense. And some of that has to do with the tariffs. They say the much advertised rebirth of U.S. manufacturing hasn't arrived. And I might just add one more word, hasn't arrived yet. But nevertheless, that is the case. And of course, one of those issues is, as we just mentioned, the crackdown on migrant workers. Foreign-born workforce has fallen by about 1 million. But this article doesn't mention the other part of it, which I'll get to in just a minute. And so again, we see a lot of these trade deals, another one coming down from the European Union. And when I was in Alaska, we talked about some of the others that had come down from a variety of places like the Philippines and Japan and elsewhere. And so the issue, of course, is that Donald Trump argued that these statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics have been politically manipulated. So that's what you get in the article I've posted for you to read. But let me now, if I can, go to our good friend Gary Bauer, who said there were a lot of people that were celebrating. And again, it always amazes me. If you don't like Donald Trump, fine, but you're celebrating that the economy is doing poorly. Well, if you want to win re-election, I guess you have to. But he also goes on in the second paragraph to say there seems to be something deeply wrong in the federal bureaucracy that is supposed to provide, he says, policymakers with accurate data on the status of the economy, because the job creation figures for June were revised down from $147,000 to just jobs to 14,000 jobs. And interestingly enough, the May one was revised down from 144,000 to 19,000. Without all the numbers, what I'm talking about here is both the May and June reports that came from the Bureau of Labor Statistics were revised down by 90%. Does that pass the straight-face test? I mean, there's something not correct about that. And he goes on to even say any private sector employee whose projections were off by 90% probably would be fired. And so that's why, of course, Donald Trump decided to actually fire the Commissioner of Labor Statistics, because his argument was simply this, that some of those numbers that were showing up this time last year during an election season and then showed up significantly in September and October were found later to be vastly inflated. And so as a result, he is arguing that indeed that is what was taking place. And so what I think is kind of interesting, though, is that if you dig deeper into this, and you probably won't hear this on any news show at all, but if you dig into it, and you can check it out for yourself, you'll see that what is happening here is these job numbers, interestingly enough, are, yes, down on the foreign workers, but they've increased by 380,000 for native-born American workers. So you can see that, of course, as we said before, some of the deportations are having an impact. And so while the overall numbers are down from what you would have expected, you have 1,500,000 foreign-born workers who now are not in some of those jobs. And so it, I think, illustrates again that if you wanted to have more jobs for Americans, that actually is what the report is. And sadly, you really have to dig quite a bit to come up with that number. It's there, but it's not the way in which it's been reported, and not even the way in which it's been documented. So it's just a good illustration that, as I've said on this program so many times, just because you see a headline, just because you hear it announced on a radio or television program, doesn't necessarily mean that that is the full story. And the more you dig into it, the more you find out it actually might be good news. We'll take a break, be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Earlier this month, Victor Davis Hanson wrote about the decline and fall of our so-called degreed experts. I believe we should trust people who are experts in science and engineering because their success or failure is easy to measure. But the political pundits and so-called experts in public policy are often wrong. He provides 5 examples. First, we're told that tariffs would destroy the economy and lead to a downfall, if not recessionary spiral. He pointed to data that showed increases in tariff revenue, personal real income and savings were up, job creation exceeded prognoses, and there was no surge in inflation. Second, economists and bureaucrats were wrong about the border. We were told that the only way to stop illegal immigration was to pass comprehensive immigration reform, and when the president promised to stop thousands of migrants crossing the border, experts scoffed. Third, many of our national security experts warned that taking out Iran's nuclear sites was a fool's errand. It would supposedly unleash a Middle East tsunami of instability, cause a wave of terrorism, would send oil prices skyrocketing. Instead, the action led to a ceasefire, not a conflagration, and oil prices decreased. Fourth, President Trump, according to diplomatic experts, was going to blow up or destroy or cripple NATO. So far, more nations are meeting their defense spending promises. Fifth, many of the pollsters were wrong about the last three presidential elections and have missed some significant shifts in the electorate. They didn't understand how ideas like defunding the police or allowing transgender males to compete in women's sports would affect the election. The lesson here is to listen to the experts, but also have some skepticism. Just because they have advanced degrees doesn't mean they're always right. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of Israel, go to viewpoints.info/Israel. Viewpoints.info/Israel. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, for just a few minutes, talk about this, what I think Matt Taibbi has said, Russiagate was a cover-up. What we're talking about is 2016, and right now what you see is a lot of the mainstream press is not covering this. If it gets mentioned at all, it's like, why are you worried about something that happened back in 2016 during the campaign? And the reason is because it goes to the highest levels of government, and the way in which some of this was discovered, interestingly enough, hasn't been covered even that well by conservative press, but I thought if nothing else, I would give you some of the background. First of all, recognize that this second article that I have for you to read, if you would like to do so, comes from Matt Taibbi. He was the editor with Rolling Stone magazine. You can't necessarily accuse him of being a fan of Donald Trump, but you can accuse him of being an investigative reporter at a time when there seem to be very few investigative reporters. And the fact that he is now willing to say that we now have enough information that comes from the special counsel John Durham to actually make the case that people were making for some time, even back in 2016, 2017, during the entire Trump presidency, because this, of course, was nagging him time and time again with a special counsel and all sorts of other issues. We now know a lot more. Why do we know that? Well, it is interesting that this has not been very well reported, but let me again quote from our friend Gary Bauer. This comes from his Thursday edition, although you can find it other places, but because we love what Gary does in digging things out, you can find it very well. And he points out that about 2 months ago, the FBI director, who was that? That's Kash Patel, made a stunning announcement. He found a secret room inside the FBI headquarters, and this is where the FBI director, James Comey, and others hid thousands of documents. By the way, I might just mention that these documents in many cases were in bags what are called burned bags that were meant to be destroyed. How incompetent are you when you're trying to cover up your conspiracy that you failed to burn the bags? But nevertheless, when you hear people talking about the FBI annex, what they're talking about is a room that apparently until 2 months ago, Kash Patel, who's the FBI director, didn't know it existed. And when he goes in there, what does he find? Well, he finds all sorts of documents, which of course are going to be very important in terms of this ongoing investigation on what Barack Obama, what James Comey, what even Hillary Clinton, the campaign, and all those wanted to do. Now, what it does is that these files really, as Gary points out, relate to the deep state's effort to try to nullify the 2016 election by talking about the fact that Donald Trump was being either an agent of the Russian government or he was being blackmailed by it. Was the collusion of Russia. And these were hidden in this secret room. They were stuffed into multiple burn bags that were supposed to be destroyed, but they were not. So, first of all, you have this information coming out. And, of course, Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, has released some of that material. And then the other day, you had something very interesting take place. A woman by the name of Susan Miller stepped forward and said she was the author of the Intelligence Community Assessment. And actually, originally, I had this article up there as well, but you can find it by Matt Vespa, the CIA agent who said she authored the 2017 report on Russian collusion, now says she didn't, which is really one of the more curious things about this, because here she came forward and said, I was the person that authored this 2017 Intelligence Community Assessment, and Tulsi Gabbard is lying. Well, of course, if you only read the headlines, you'd say, well, then that was a body blow to Tulsi Gabbard. But the bottom line is, for whatever reason, and I think part of it was because of this particular investigation by Matt Taibbi, because I think he was the first to point out, no, she was not there, and she did not write that. And so, indeed, she finally came out and said that, which was interesting. But you can go to the June 30th X statement by Matt Taibbi. I did not write the ICA, which again was a summary of what that is. She says she was not an author and she was not involved. So first of all, before we even go any further, you have to say, what would possess her to go up and use, because this is like a suicide mission. You've been a CIA agent of some sort. You've been at least working in the Central Intelligence Agency in some capacity, to then come forward, say you wrote this, and then later admit that you did not. I mean, you talk about committing political and, if you will, employment suicide. Who's going to want to work with her anytime in the future? But nevertheless, that is the case. And interestingly enough, was outed by, again, Matt Taibbi, and that is the case. And so, again, going back to some of these files, it turns out that in this hidden FBI room, we have information that comes from John Durham, who investigated the FBI's conduct in what was called Crossfire Hurricane, that later, of course, became the Russia collusion hoax. And as a result, we now know a little bit more. Here, if you read the piece by Matt Taibbi, by about the third page, he gives you kind of a good summary that comes from John Durham, and that is this. He says, number one, Hillary Clinton and her team apparently hoped to deflect from her email scandal and the other problems by tying the campaign of Trump to Vladimir Putin. You might remember at the time she had very sensitive documents from the State Department on a personal server. So to deflect from that, they came up with a way to focus time and attention on Donald Trump's campaign in Russia. Number two, American security services learned that these plans. Number three, that this is the most important, he says, instead of outing them, the authorities used the state resources to massively expand and amplify her scheme. And then finally, the last stage required the enthusiastic and cooperation from the entire commercial news business, which cheered as conspirators made an enforcement target of Trump, actually, rather than an irrelevant bystander. And so again, his argument is that these people were awarding each other, Pulitzer Prizes, claiming that they had really been able to break this story rather dramatically. And when it was all said and done, it was something that was used originally by the Clinton campaign to deflect from some of the criticism she was receiving and instead focus criticism erroneously on Donald Trump and saying he was somehow tied to Russia. And of course, we went through the Russian collusion, spent tens of millions of dollars to find out there was no there. So anyway, if you want to read a little bit more about this, I've given you that article by Matt Taibbi. You can source some of the others as well. But the bottom line is we are going to have an investigation that's going to last a lot longer. And again, I've warned everyone not to overuse certain terms. This was campaign dirty tricks. This was a conspiracy. I don't think you're ever going to commit anybody to actually being prosecuted for treason or sedition, but it's bad enough, and we don't need to use words like treason when we talk about the kinds of things that were such an incredible interruption in the first 4 years of Donald Trump's administration, really the first 3 years at least, and so that is the case. Just before we take a break, though, I thought I might just mention if you go to our website today, you're going to see a $10 bill and Alexander Hamilton. And as you probably know, Point of View is listener supported. What you may not know is that probably less than 1% of all the people that listen to Point of View actually give to support this program. But we've sort of done the math, and we estimated that really if every listener could just give $10, we would cover the cost of doing the program. So we thought this might be a good way to maybe encourage those of you that have not supported this ministry to think about maybe just giving $10. If you're currently a supporter, first of all, I want to say thank you because you're one of the less than 1% that do. But if you go to our website right now at pointofview.net, click on that button that says Give Now, we've got an opportunity for you to give $10 or $15, $25, whatever you might want to do, because we are a listener-supported program. Now, you also, if you receive emails from us, probably will have an email that will provide that link as well. But I just wanted to, as we go to a break, suggest that if you have never given before, and even today, learn some things you would not have known if you hadn't listened to Point of View, can I at least challenge you to give $10? That would really mean a lot. It would be a way of saying, I believe in what you're doing, can't give much, but I'd like to give something. And so that's kind of our $10 campaign for today. If you go to the website pointofview.net, you can give. Of course, you can give us a call, 800-347-5151.
You already know that Point of View relies on people like you, listeners, to stay on the air. And here's something that you might not know. Only 1% of Point of View's listening audience currently gives. You heard that right, just 1%. But we've done the math, and if every listener, including you, gave just $10, that would be enough to fund Point of View for an entire year. So here is my challenge to you. If you have never given before, please spare $10 to help keep truth on the air. Your support will fund the daily broadcast as well as additional resources that equip listeners to apply God's truth in their own lives. In short, Americans need Point of View, and we need you. Give your $10 online at pointofview.net. Or you can give by calling toll-free 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're going to be talking about this very good article that appeared in World Magazine. Those of you watching online, I've got my copy here of World Magazine, which has the cover story, Can Classical Liberalism Be Saved? As you well know, we certainly appreciate the great work that is done at World Magazine. I've been following it ever since. A friend of mine, Marvin Olasky, who I knew from the University of Texas at Austin, went to work with Joe Belts. And of course, over the years, we've interviewed many of the authors with World Magazine, but this one in particular was so significant that, first of all, I did a commentary on it. Those of you that receive my commentary will see that it is the one that ran on July 17th. And also, interestingly enough, just by accident, my commentary today, Why the West Won, also relates very much to this. This very well-written article is written by Jenny Lind Schmit. She is the Global Desk Chief and Europe reporter for World Magazine, World News Group. She and her husband live in both Switzerland and Washington State and joins us now by phone. So, Jenny, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hello, thank you for having me.
First of all, a lot of this comes from a particular a conference which had the very long title, the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship Conference. And many of the speakers are people that we've had on this program. Arthur Brooks, who's now at Harvard, Oz Guinness, who's been on the program with us for decades. Even U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson, we knew him when he was just working here at First Liberty Institute. And what was so interesting is that they were asking a fundamental question, which is the cover story. We believe that the Western world came from what we call classical liberalism, the so-called liberal vision, and yet today there is a willingness to really turn our back upon that. And so you were looking to see whether or not we can really save what has become the foundation of Western civilization.
Yeah, this has been a topic and an issue that has interested me for a long, long time, especially as an observer of culture and society. I've lived a lot of my life outside the United States, but consider myself a proud and loyal American, and watching, sometimes going away and coming back, you notice things. And so it's been a particular interest to me, and I think like a fish that doesn't notice the water that it's swimming in, so much of our society in the United States doesn't recognize where the freedoms that are being debated, where our particular culture comes from. And so something drew my attention to this conference. I looked at the lineup of speakers and I said, I've got to be there. So it was fascinating to be in the audience. You didn't really know which breakout session to go to because they were all so good, and people whose work I've read over the years all together for this one event. So yeah, it was a really very interesting conference. And interesting also because of the people who didn't necessarily, they were there as skeptics. And I got to talk to some of them as I go into the article. But yeah, I think I really admire the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship just for getting people together, for having this conversation, and for bringing and saying, no, this is a conversation we need to have, whether or not our citizenship or our civilization as we know it can be renewed, and if so, how? So I appreciate you bringing up the topic, and I appreciated your commentary earlier that fit right in by Niall Ferguson. So, yeah.
Let me, if I can, put some perspective, because when people hear the word liberalism, I remember when I was in graduate school, whether it was George Carey or Gene Kirkpatrick or a number of other professors I had, they used to talk about liberalism, and I'm thinking, are you talking about liberal, like politics?
Right.
And that back then, the liberal vision was something that came from the Reformation, it came from the Enlightenment. You have some of the historic voices, and you've got John Locke, David Hume, Adam Smith, Immanuel Kant, Thomas Jefferson, Friedrich Hayek. But what we're talking about here is classical liberalism that goes all the way back to the things that we take for granted today, the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, ultimately our U.S. Constitution. And some of those individuals were Christians. Some of them were very hostile to Christianity. But this idea of individual rights, of the idea of consent of the governed, and a variety of other things that we sort of take for granted today, all came out of this experience. And when you were at that conference, there were many that were thinking, I'm not sure we can go back, because even the non-Christians sort of operated from sort of a belief in absolute truth, and various truths were inevitable, and that they were certainly endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Those ideas today have sort of faded away, because there are a whole generation of individuals that really don't know our history and don't know why we even believe in human rights. Don't you think?
Yeah, I do. And I think that, in the last generation, potentially you can talk about people who are atheists. And you mentioned even some of our founders weren't necessarily evangelical Christians in the way that we would think of them. But I would say even people in the past few generations who say they were atheists, they were Christian atheists. That is to say that the structure on which they refuse to believe in God, the water they were swimming in was Christian water. And so it's very easy to say, well, I don't believe in God. I don't believe he's going to impose certain things on me, when you live in a society that grants individual rights and the rule of law. But if you take away that background information and kind of this understanding that we're all together on the idea, if someone commits a crime, they have the right to a trial, that I can have free speech, I can freely associate with those that I want to, I can worship freely. If you take away that underlying structure, then that becomes, we're sort of swimming in this in a morass of, well, where do our values come from?
That's right.
And something I think is fascinating, though, is some of the thinkers nowadays who are talking about, even if you're not a Christian, if you don't believe as a Christian would in faith, you have to understand that many of these values come out of those beliefs, that all creatures are made in the image of God, that humans are made in the image of God. Therefore, there's human dignity. Therefore, there's a reason that we want to protect life. There's and human dignity. And so I think I see a start of a shift of understanding for some people in the newer generation who haven't grown up with some of those foundational beliefs. They're starting to ask the question, well, where maybe there is something to that.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise, why are we all here? And what is the point of life? And we see a lot of anxiety, depression, many problems in our society, but there are some people who are starting to ask the question, well, what is that? And we see that in the Bible sales are starting to go up. Church attendance is starting to rise. It's just the tippy tiny beginning of a beginning. But I think that's encouraging that some people are starting to ask the right questions. And I do think it's connected to this.
I think so. Yes. And let me just mention, since we're coming to a break, and we'll come back and get into this in a little bit more detail, that the upcoming Outlook magazine, it won't be in the one that arrives this month, but next month, is about Gen Z and about some of the things that we have actually heard Jenny Lind Schmit talking about. And again, in my commentary, I talk about the fact that if we really want to come and recapture some of these ideas, we really do need to return to some of these bedrock Christian principles. And of course, as you point out, we'll talk about this after the break, you were chatting with individuals who aren't necessarily calling for a revival or a reformation, but indeed, if you don't have individuals inside the church, first of all, having interest in biblical principles, the kind of things we talk about here on Point of View every day, the kinds of things that you and so many of your writers write about in World Magazine, we can't necessarily expect people outside the church not to focus on some of those as well. So it does seem to me that part of that has to do with what are those kind of foundational principles. And so we'll come back and continue our conversation today, because it is, again, the lead story in the July issue of World Magazine, Can Classical Liberalism Be Saved? We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, continue our conversation with Jenny Lind Schmit for just a few more minutes, a writer for World Magazine. I might just mention we have posted her article. It has the title, Cracks in the Foundation, Can Western Civilization Survive the Collapse of Classical Liberal Values? There's a place where you can read it. You can also subscribe to it if you'd like. I might just mention in the same issue, there's one by Mark Mitchell on diagnosing the disease and many other great articles, but we have posted that one. And Jenny Lind, for just a minute, let's, if we can, maybe use Adam Smith as an example, because both in your article as well as in Patrick Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed, there's kind of this argument that in some respects, liberalism contained the seeds of its own destruction, because one of the arguments is self-interest as a guiding principle, you say, begets greed, nihilism, and eventual social collapse. Well, that idea goes back to Adam Smith, in which he wrote in The Wealth of Nations that as each individual seeks his or her own self-interest, they're led by an invisible hand to benefit society. But one of the things that graduate school sometimes forces you to do is to read more than just The Wealth of Nations. I was required to also read his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And when you understand the context, this idea of self-interest wasn't selfishness. It was really the idea that as each pursues their own good for themselves, they create a good for society as a whole. But when you remove this idea of morality, you remove this idea of a biblical foundation or even a belief in moral absolutes, then ultimately this idea of self-interest does become sort of a survival of the fittest mentality, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does, and I think you outlined that very well. Of the idea that if self-interest in the sense of me, if self-interest and working in the self-interest for my own good means, well, complete and total freedom, I can do whatever I want. That's a bad understanding, and our founders really wanted to have self-interest in the sense of self-interest for my ultimate good, with the understanding that my ultimate good is to be humble and submissive to my Creator. And I think that is where we have gone astray somewhat as a society and a culture, because if self-interest just means whatever I want to do, well, yeah, I can create my own reality. And what I think is interesting is when you actually talk to sensible people, like some of the people that I met, and one of the ones that I kind of became the face of the story, he's not a believer, he's not a Christian, not a religious person, but just someone with a lot of common sense.
Right.
And he, looking around, could see that things weren't adding up. And that is why he ended up at this conference. His name was Ryan Collins, and he ended up at this conference. He followed a follower of Jordan Peterson, and a new father. And I could kind of in the conversation with him see how he's looking ahead here. Okay, what's the world that I'm passing on to my daughter? How can I secure a world for her? How can I make it better? And I really think that the things he had to say, he kind of encapsulated what ARC was trying to do. It wasn't trying to solve all the problems, but to have conversations and to get people involved in conversations and to, all right, maybe I can't do anything on this big global scale. There's huge problems, but what can I do in my own backyard? Whose life can I affect for the good, and meaning a civic good, to live in peace and safety, in tranquility with my neighbors, and for the betterment of mankind. And it was interesting because he has realized in this kind of ongoing search or that he seems to be on, has realized the importance of a faith community, and in having support for his family life. So I thought that was interesting that here's a person of common sense, but he's going to, rationally thinking through, is leading him on an investigation of faith and the claims of Christ and church community. So I thought that was really, really interesting.
I do love your quote from Ryan Collins because, he knew something wasn't quite right. And up until now, oftentimes Christianity is seen as not only irrelevant, but evil. And one of the pictures that is in the magazine, which unfortunately is not shown in the particular online one that we've provided, is a picture of them standing in front of this particular group. Christian teaching is not extremism. And that, I think, again, Jenny Lind, is one of the problems that up until now, whether it's been the so-called new atheist, although Richard Dawkins is starting to say, well, maybe Christianity does have some positives, or Daniel Dennett, or a variety of other people, they are all saying that actually religion is dangerous. They're recognizing what this completely secularized world is. Maybe we should come back and recognize that the Christian foundations of Western civilization gave us Western civilization. Right. And if we jettison those, we end up with something that is not exactly utopia.
Right. You could see Western secularization, or look at a nation and a society like in Iran. Currently, I've been reporting from Christians in Iran, and what they're suffering under. They do not have rule of law. They do not have separation of, it's not church, but of religion. And you realize, there are some there. I don't want to live under Islam, and neither do many of the people that I met there and at this conference. And looking at that, okay, secular liberalism has had its day, but if we have to decide which civilization we want to live under, maybe we better take a look at how we got to the one that we have. Maybe it's not all bad. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's some really good things. And obviously, I think, there can be a call to go back to some Gilded Age, which I think is not, I'm not sure who would want to really do that, because the past is the past and we can't go back. But what can we take forward into a new era where we really herald and rejoice in the freedoms that we have, in the structures that have been put in place in the United States. I think there is an educational value that is necessary. People aren't hearing those things. Students aren't hearing those things. And so I loved, as I mentioned, the commentary you had earlier. Share this with some students. They're not hearing this in college. What made the West good? What were the values that made it strong and good? And I hope as we go into a world, we're preparing for next year's 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and we are thinking, all right, how do we encourage and how do we think about what are these civic values? What is a civic value that we've lost? We've kind of lost sight of as a society, but those are things that those are things I think we can strengthen and go back to having a strong idea of civic value and civic duty in our society.
Might just mention, too, what the upcoming booklet is on One Nation Under God, looking at some of those foundational principles. But just before I run out of time, let me just mention that this is, of course, the article, Can Classical Liberalism Be Saved? You might even want to get an entire copy of the July issue. But maybe we can have you on in the future, because you have written about World Tour Christians in Iran, and that is a topic we certainly address on a regular basis. So I certainly want to say thank you for writing the article. Thank you for giving us some time today, and maybe we can do it again real soon.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure for me.
Going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about what's happening in public higher education. And don't forget, we are encouraging those of you that maybe have never donated to Point of View. How about $10? Just a way of saying thank you. We've made it very easy for you to give. Just go to the website. We'll be right back.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
My husband and I are your supporters. We just really appreciate the show and the people you bring on.
I just want to commend you guys on your program. I love listening to you. It's a blessing. Been listening to you for several years. Your program has helped my family see current events and elections and politics through the eyes and the principles of Scripture. And that's been enlightening, and we're trying to pass that on to others.
I want to say, first of all, that I really enjoyed the Millennial Roundtable, and I love the program altogether. I think Kerby is great, and I really appreciate all of y'all, all that y'all do, and the truth that y'all put out.
Hey, great show. Love all your comments and what you're talking about.
Thanks again for what you do.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We're going to be talking about higher education for a while. And a couple of things. First of all, you are well aware of the fact that there have been some very significant fines levied against some of the Ivy League schools. Columbia paying, was it $220 million? And Harvard University, some of the grants being affected and questioning whether or not to even have a tax-exempt status, and on and on. I might just mention our guest is an author of a book called Slacking, A Guide to Ivy League Miseducation. But the article we've posted for you actually is one that appeared in the Daily Signal. University systems create a creditor focused on merit and outcomes. And it does seem to me that if you've been around higher education, and of course we've had a chance to interview university presidents and former presidents who then ran for Senate, the people like Ben Sass and others, that have all been very concerned about what is happening in higher education. So we thought it would be good for you to hear from Adam Kissell, who is a visiting fellow for higher education in reform in the Center for Education Policy there at the Heritage Foundation, an organization I do encourage you to support. He is a board member for the University of West Florida, Southern Wesleyan University, National Association of Scholars. He's a graduate of University of Chicago as well of Harvard University, and he actually lives in Charleston, West Virginia. So, Adam, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby. Glad to be with you.
Let's, if we can, talk about the issue of merit. It does seem to me that we would expect that universities would produce individuals, first of all, accept individuals into programs based upon merit. And yet, of course, we've had real questions as to whether or not people that deserve to be on these college campuses were denied because they weren't the right, gender, ethnic background, whatever it might be. But most importantly, we would assume that if we're going to spend the kinds of dollars that we spend to get the kind of education that is required today of higher education and the kind of loans and debt that individuals would go into, that we would graduate people that would actually, first of all, graduate, and second of all, would be able to perform the job. And that's one of the reasons why you've started looking at these accreditation agencies, isn't it?
It is. That's a great introduction. So accreditation is a seal of approval about the quality of an institution. It should be caring about what students learn, outcomes, as well as economic outcomes, moral formation. And unfortunately, accreditors focus on the inputs. How many books are in your library? How many square feet do you have in the classroom? So a bunch of states have said, you know what, we're going to focus on actual merit, and we're going to give a seal of approval to institutions that have great outcomes for their students instead of just great inputs. So that's a great start.
Well, and I think your point's well taken. Sometimes they look at the least important. One of the colleges I went to, I remember my father, of all things, asking, I don't see that they have a Phi Beta Kappa chapter here on this campus. And the answer that came back from the university official was, well, they don't have enough books in the library. And I was thinking, No, they have quite a number of books in the library. I have gone into that library many times to find this book, that book, whatever. It wasn't in the right categories. And so to say that because you didn't have these books, well, you couldn't have this particular chapter, or because you didn't have the books in the right areas in terms of liberal arts, you could not necessarily be accredited, I think shows that maybe, to use the old phrase, the emphasis is on the wrong syllable, don't you think?
That's right. And so, unfortunately, so many people in higher education policy focus on the general circumstances rather than on what students are actually experiencing and learning. So our book, Slacking, looks at the real curriculum in the general education requirements. Those are the core curriculum that every educated person should have to become part of the fellowship of educated men and women, as Harvard says. And we looked at those courses, and we found that for the most part in the humanities and social sciences, you can be a slacker, and in fact, you're encouraged to be a slacker. At Yale, to meet your arts requirement, arts and humanities, you could take a course called Introduction to the Occult Sciences, and you learn about astrology and alchemy and recipes for summoning demons and angels. It's a real course. It meets your humanities requirement. If you want to learn about angels and devils, maybe you should read the Bible and Dante and not Introduction to the Occult.
Well, and again, there is a sense in which you and I both have Ivy League degrees, in which people hear about that, and it used to be people go, "Oh, wow," and now they go, I don't know. I mean, I've really got some questions about that. And again, you have situations that you talk about in which sometimes you have a 4-year graduation rate under 15%, where you have individuals that are investing 6 figures of debt in order to graduate, and what they learn is questionable, and what they hear on college campuses is a pervasive anti-Semitism, so something needed to change.
Right. All of these themes come together in the way the Trump administration is settling the discrimination claims with places like Penn and Brown and Columbia with very high dollars attached, but what's even more important than the dollars is the universities are committing to merit in admissions, committing to merit in faculty hiring, committing to equal justice when it comes to international students on visas versus American students. And it's not really the role of the federal government to get in on curriculum, but where the curriculum is indoctrinating and violating civil rights because it's that bad, then the federal government does have something to say, and universities are going to have to keep complying if they want to keep getting their federal dollars.
Well, again, you have Harvard president and others, Alan Garber and others, just simply saying, we are not going to knuckle under the administration. And really, nobody wants the administration or the Secretary of Education to tell Harvard how to teach. But when you are producing poorly qualified graduates, and when anti-Semitism reigns on the campus, and very lack of rigorous kinds of courses are being used for graduation, it does seem to me that if nothing else, we need to do more than just simply say buyer beware. You are going to receive all sorts of benefits in terms of endowments that you have, in terms of having tax exempted all sorts of aspects of that university. And so I think there is a place for the government to be involved. So let's take a break. And when we come back, though, I do want to talk about a positive, and that is a commission for public higher education, something which, interestingly enough, is happening in many of the states where we broadcast: North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, to mention some. And so this may be a very significant positive. You also have what is called the HERO Act, and we'll explain more about what that is in just a minute. And so there's a couple of things that might be of encouragement to individuals. So rather than lament the sorry state of public education today, help is on the way, and so when we come back, we'll spend some time talking about that. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the conversation that we're having, you can go to the website, pointofview.net. Our fourth article is one that appeared in the Daily Signal, written by Adam Kissell. We'll continue our conversation with him right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Earlier this month, Victor Davis Hanson wrote about the decline and fall of our so-called degreed experts. I believe we should trust people who are experts in science and engineering because their success or failure is easy to measure. But the political pundits and so-called experts in public policy are often wrong. He provides 5 examples. First, we're told that tariffs would destroy the economy and lead to a downfall, if not recessionary spiral. He pointed to data that showed increases in tariff revenue, personal real income and savings were up, job creation exceeded prognoses, and there was no surge in inflation. Second, economists and bureaucrats were wrong about the border. We were told that the only way to stop illegal immigration was to pass comprehensive immigration reform, and when the president promised to stop thousands of migrants crossing the border, experts scoffed. Third, many of our national security experts warned that taking out Iran's nuclear sites was a fool's errand. It would supposedly unleash a Middle East tsunami of instability, cause a wave of terrorism, would send oil prices skyrocketing. Instead, the action led to a ceasefire, not a conflagration, and oil prices decreased. Fourth, President Trump, according to diplomatic experts, was going to blow up or destroy or cripple NATO. So far, more nations are meeting their defense spending promises. Fifth, many of the pollsters were wrong about the last 3 presidential elections and have missed some significant shifts in the electorate. They didn't understand how ideas like defunding the police or allowing transgender males to compete in women's sports would affect the election. The lesson here is to listen to the experts, but also have some skepticism. Just because they have advanced degrees doesn't mean they're always right. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of Israel, go to viewpoints.info/Israel. Viewpoints.info/Israel. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Adam Kissell with us, and he is visiting professor and fellow for higher education reform at the Center for Educational Policy at the Heritage Foundation, and also the author of this article that I think you will find very helpful. And let's, if we can, Adam, get into the Commission for Public Higher Education. This is something that is being developed right now in a number of different states, led by the state of Florida, also state systems, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, a lot of places where we broadcast. And it does seem to me that help is on the way. Tell us more if you might.
So once again, accreditation is a seal of approval that demonstrates to other colleges and the public and parents that the college is meeting minimum standards. But what it also does is it gives you access to federal student aid, which the taxpayers fund to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars a year. The problem is that accreditation has been abused by the accreditors because they know they hold the keys to that hundreds of billions of dollars.
Wow.
So they have put DEI into their standards, and they've interfered with university governance. So these southeastern states have said, we're going to form our own accreditor, and we're going to do things the right way based on merit and not on DEI.
Well, again, decoupling this whole idea of accreditation from financial aid, it's the old carrot and stick. All of a sudden, I don't have a stick, and that's, I think, very significant. Something else that I thought would be worthwhile is talking about the HERO Act, because it was originally proposed by then Representative Ron DeSantis. You know, I didn't really follow his career as much when he was a member of Congress. I followed him quite a bit now that he's, of course, governor of the state of Florida, and Senator Mike Lee. But this also seems like something that would be very beneficial to incoming students and future students and even graduates. Can you help us with that?
Right. So the HERO Act is part of this policy idea of decoupling accreditation from federal student aid. You still need somebody to vouch for a college and say, can we be spending lots of money on this college or not? But the states already do that through what's called state authorization. You don't need the feds to interfere, and you don't need the accreditors, these third parties, to interfere. Let accreditors do the only thing that they could be good at, which is to look at the quality of an institution and not have this extra role of qualifying you for federal student aid. Let the states do that instead. So the HERO Act decouples federal student aid from the qualitative work of quality improvement, and quality assurance doesn't need to be there in the same way. It's a very wonky idea, but it's important because it frees colleges to innovate, and it frees states to do what they think is best for the colleges that are in their state.
It's just, again, something that needed to happen, especially when we've seen a lot of the DEI and other kinds of abuses there. But there was something else that you pointed out, and that was complete news to me, and that is that what we normally have had in the past are regional accreditors. And so, again, we'll use some of the places where we broadcast: North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Georgia. We might even add Virginia in there as well, because that was another one that was there. And, of course, some of the other places. So, you, of course, mentioned Tennessee and Texas, but up until now, you were sort of doing it regionally, but now the argument is you could become a national accreditor, and that'll allowed at least Florida and North Carolina to mandate that these public institutions, which again are paid for, if you will, in part by the tax dollars of people in that state, to change their accreditor and not be stuck with some of those that are trying to enforce some kind of woke ideology on the university.
You have it right. So up until towards the end of the first Trump administration, everybody pretty much had one accreditor to choose from, and that was based on what state they were, what region they were in, these regional accreditors. But Trump 1 said, you know what, all of those regionals, now you have to be in competition with one another. You can't just abuse your local monopoly. A college can choose any of those regional accreditors. So they all became national, and anybody could choose them. But what then Florida and North Carolina said is, you know, we still don't think that's good enough. We need to form our own accreditor. Our experience with our regional accreditor, known as SACS, the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, has interfered with governance, doesn't care about ROI, does care about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we care more about merit and outcomes for our students. And then Louisiana also joined the party. So now there's 7 states in this Commission for Public Higher Ed. And they can set a standard. And this new commission is going to have national scope too. So other states can join the party as well.
So again, some of you may have young people going off to college. Maybe a very small number of you listening actually serve on a board for a local university, and you would like to know about this as well. And I think what we are talking about here, Adam, is since this has sort of developed, this Commission for Public Higher Education, it could mean for a while that some of these institutions would be like double accredited. I don't see any problem with that, but that's another kind of issue that might surface in the future, don't you think?
That's right. So in order to be considered eligible for federal student aid, you have to be accredited by a recognized accreditor. Well, that means there's bureaucracy. So to be a recognized accreditor, you have to show you have 2 years of accreditation experience. So these 7 states can't just switch their public universities over until 2 years from now. So in the meantime, they need to show that the new accreditor is actually accrediting for 2 years, and they can't give up their old accreditation, whether it's SACS or whether it's, say, in Florida or North Carolina, a new one among the existing regionals. So that means you're double accredited. So you've got the new accreditor once they have standards up and running and they're accrediting, but also you keep your old accreditor, because if you gave that up, you'd have to give up your federal student aid at least until 2 years from now. Now, what we're trying to do from the policy point of view is say, do you really need 2 years of accreditation experience? These are state systems that already have lots of public universities they oversee. So maybe 1 year in the case of those, this new accreditor is going to be enough. So maybe we'll be able to get out from the double accreditation a little faster.
Well, again, I wanted to make this available. First of all, if you have a young person going off to college, you'd like to know about this. But I also have met some of our listeners that actually serve on the boards of some of the universities, and they may want to know about this as well. Just in Alaska, for example, I was with an individual that is in that case, and they might want to know more about this, a particular commission on public higher education, which is primarily happening in the South or the Southeast. And, of course, we have so many listeners in the states of North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, as well as Texas. Now, of course, you had just added Louisiana to that and Virginia. So if something you might want to know about, and that's why I wanted to cover that. But more importantly, so many of us are concerned, as you pointed out, we seem to be less concerned about ROI instead DEI. And it seems to me that we should see a return on investment. And when we have entirely too many young people graduating, either not graduating at all, and we have very low graduation rates, or then when they graduate within poor financial outcomes, we need to bring about a change. And again, this is the kind of story I like to cover on Point of View, and I doubt you'll hear about it in any other news outlet, but we covered it today on Point of View. And so, Adam, thank you for covering it. Thank you for writing about it, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby. I enjoyed being with you.
Let's, if we can, take a break. And one more time, let me just mention that one of the things we were encouraging maybe those of you listening to Point of View, but maybe have never given, can we just maybe suggest a $10 gift? And it's really very simple. First of all, let me again thank those of you that currently support this ministry. We really could not do it without you. But we just thought that as we come into the month of August, just a $10 gift is a way to say, hey, I appreciate what you're doing. You click on the button and it opens up a possibility that you can give $10, or there's a button you can click for $15, $20. Single gift. Of course, I hope some of you might even think about giving on a monthly basis, because after all, we are providing you news and information and content you probably don't hear just anywhere else, and that's exactly what we would like to do. So again, you can find some great material on the website today. We've posted information about the economy and tariffs and the job numbers. We've talked about this idea of the Russia gate, as it has been referred to. We've talked about classical liberalism, talked about this commission on public higher education. We come back, I want to finish off with two very good commentaries, one by Jonathan Turley, a law professor at George Washington University, and then another one by Victor Davis Hanson, who's at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. But again, as you go to the website, you can click on that button that says Give Now. My Viewpoints commentary, Why the West Won. If you haven't seen that, I think it would be a resource that you would like to read and maybe pass on to others. But for those of you that have never given before, how about $10? We'd greatly appreciate it, and we'll be right back.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.org pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, we're going to get into a couple other articles that I thought would be of interest to you. The first one comes from an individual that, again, I tend to quote on a regular basis, even though I would suspect that if we had him on the program, he would disagree with a lot of things we talk about here on Point of View. But I do appreciate the honesty of Jonathan Turley. Now, the value of what he writes is, I think, even more emphasized by the fact that he is a professor of law at George Washington University. I would imagine that he would probably agree with the argument that he supports the Democratic Party, probably has on almost every occasion voted for a Democrat for president, but nevertheless has been very concerned about what he sees happening in the United States Senate. In particular, focuses a lot of his concern on Cory Booker. Now, first of all, let's remind ourselves of a little bit of history. Earlier, we were talking with Jenny Lind Schmit, and she was saying something that I agree with. This year, we really want to emphasize more and more the 250th anniversary of this country. And there are the good stories and the bad stories. There are some very significant aspects of American history. There's some very dark chapters in American history. But when you talk about the United States Senate, it was considered to be one of the great deliberative bodies. And you think of in the 19th century, Henry Clay's speech, Daniel Webster. You come into this last century or so, you can think of some great speeches by Daniel Patrick Moynihan. I wouldn't necessarily agree with some of the things that Huey Long said or all those, Margaret Chase Smith, but you're talking about some individuals who actually gave rousing speeches in the U.S. Senate. And it is interesting that Jonathan Turley begins by saying, when President James Buchanan declared the U.S. Senate is the world's greatest deliberative body, he clearly had not envisioned Senator Cory Booker, Democrat from New Jersey. And yet another tirade he says on the floor, Senator Booker attacked not just President Donald Trump, but his Democratic colleagues, and we'll get into that in just a minute, for voting for a bipartisan bill on law enforcement. And so, of course, he is best known for saying, I am Spartacus, so you can, of course, take it where you go. But when you think about what the Senate was intended to be, there is in this second paragraph a great story. I'm going to put it in one of my commentaries or maybe in our booklet or something like that, because in 1872, there was an account that was published about the meeting from Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. And at the time, Thomas Jefferson questioned Washington's support for the creation of a second or upper house in the form of the Senate. Remember that there was this idea in England of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And so when they started talking about having not only a representative body based upon population, but also a second body that would be based upon the states, Jefferson wasn't really into that. He was more into democracy than republic at the time. And so one of the questions George Washington asked of Thomas Jefferson while they were having coffee was this: why did you just pour that coffee into your saucer before drinking it? And Thomas Jefferson said, well, to cool it, my throat is not made of brass. Even so, George Washington answered, we pour our legislation into the senatorial saucer to cool it. And the argument is that there would be a great deal of passions in the House of Representatives. You can figure that out if you read Federalist Paper number 10 by James Madison, Federalist Paper number 51 by James Madison, and you get the sense that they recognize that this, because the representatives were elected every 2 years, they would be very sensitive to the emotions and the fervor of the voters. Thus, They wanted to make sure that the Senate was insulated from that, and so the senators served for 6 years, and until this last century, they were actually selected by the state legislature. And so in some respects, even hot legislation that came over to the Senate was allowed to cool. But that isn't exactly what we find today from some of the things of Cory Booker. And that's where he says, again, the design of James Madison to force compromise, deliberation, serving 6 years, even requiring the fact that you had to break a filibuster so that you would have wiser kind of legislation. But now he says, cue Cory Booker. Cory Booker, for example, and I'm again quoting now from Jonathan Turley, putting the claims of a secret police and once again the imminent collapse of a democracy, Cory Booker was immediately set upon by his colleagues, his fellow Democratic colleagues, after he moved to block bipartisan bill by fellow Democratic Senators Catherine Cortez Masto from Nevada and Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota. Amy Klobuchar said this. She said, "I will note that Senator Booker objected to my police reauthorization bill, the cops funding, the Clinton cops funding, long before Donald Trump came into office." So this is not just about this. This is a long dispute about this kind of funding. And so, again, she also, interestingly enough, snapped back at Cory Booker, saying he could not make any key hearing on the drafting of the bill because of a, quote, conflict. And she noted, "I can't help it if someone couldn't change their schedule to be here." A pretty good shot there. Cortez Masto also struck back on the notion that Democrats should simply refuse to cooperate from the administration, or that somehow working with this current administration, the Trump administration, was complicity. Now, why is Cory Booker doing it? Well, Jonathan Turley doesn't even have to guess. We all know. He is hopefully running for the presidency. He sees himself as a person that should really come up against, I don't know who it would be, J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio, whoever it might be, and wants to tap into the rage of the leftist in the Democratic Party. And so in some respects, he's even been critical of the minority leader, Chuck Schumer, for pandering to some of those individuals and denounced some of those people as being establishment. But he ends by making these statements. Jonathan Turley says, Booker just raised the ante for Democrats. They must either join the resistance and the rage or face the ire of their party. In the interim, the constitutional system will suffer. We need the House of Representatives as the people's house. We do not need two houses of representatives. The Senate ideally moderates, not magnifies, the pressures and passions of the political system. And so Jonathan Turley ends by simply saying this. Cory Booker's tirades clearly resonate with some on the far left, but it is likely to come at a cost to the institution itself. He says, as tensions build on the Democratic side, Teddy Roosevelt's quip seems to be coming true in voting for bipartisan legislation. That is, Teddy Roosevelt one time said, when they call the roll in the Senate, the senators do not know whether to answer present or not guilty. Great turn of phrase. But again, one of the things that we do want to be talking about this year of as we celebrate 250 years since the Declaration of Independence is the wisdom of the founders. We, I think, as we have seen, almost every other state, with the exception of Nebraska, they all have bicameral legislatures. They recognize the value of having people elected in different ways. And, of course, most of them are simply elected by population, but nevertheless having a senator from a state representing a larger area than a representative from that state, I think makes some sense. And the original function of the Senate, which was 6 years, as well as individuals that were selected by the state legislature, were an opportunity to cool some of the hot legislation that would come over from the House of Representatives. So 3 cheers for Jonathan Turley, an individual that, of course, as a lawyer, understands the constitutional structure, and as I think an illustration of why back in 1872, when there was a discussion that was documented of a previous discussion, which I suspect took place a few years before, between Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. Washington recognized, you pour your coffee into the saucer to cool it. We want to pour our legislation into the senatorial saucer to cool it as well. Thanks in no part to, unfortunately, an individual by the name of Cory Booker. Let's take a break. We have more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Right, for a few more minutes, one of the articles I have here is by Victor Davis Hanson, and leave it to Victor Davis Hanson to not only talk about the conflict that took place in Cincinnati, the white individuals that were beat up by some of the African-American students, but then to end by talking about the actress and model Sydney Sweeney. So we get both the issue of what happened in Cincinnati Cincinnati to, of course, the American Eagle commercial. I was tempted when people would ask, where have you been last week? I said, well, I was shooting a jeans commercial with American Eagle. Well, I'd be just kidding. But nevertheless, he has this ability to pull together two very interesting things. And he's got 7 points. You can read it on your own, but let me go through at least the 7 very quickly. And again, you are familiar with this, no doubt. A large group of black youths began pummeling white adults in downtown Cincinnati. This is, of course, an altercation that has gone national. It hasn't been just something being covered in the Buckeye State. And he talks about the fact that there were a number of disturbing aspects of the beatdown. Number one, he says the violence broke out along racial and age fault lines. After the initial one-on-one dispute, groups of black youth swarm solitary older white bystanders to pound them. And so, again, to recognize that there was not only a racial issue, but an age issue there as well. Number two, he says the surrounding assembled group of black youths not only failed to intervene to restrain the bullies, they also recorded the beatings for social media and were heard cheering on the one-sided violence. Again, if you want to get a sense of sort of the animal nature of what is unfolding oftentimes in many of these urban areas, that one captured it only so well. Number three, he says there was neither a police presence nor any timely Good Samaritan interventions. Instead, what ended the attacks was simply the fact that at least 2 of the targets appeared comatose, so their assailants apparently concluded that their agenda of beating whites into unconsciousness was mostly complete. I will at least give partial credit for individuals that see that unfolding and as a result wonder if they're going to step in, because it did seem that the one woman who was beat into unconsciousness actually at one point was trying to stop that. And we all recognize that unless we have 1 or 2 next to us, we, as we try to stop a confrontation, can be the next target of it as well. Number 4, he says, oddly, few of the usual black spokespeople who habitually comment on interracial violence were to be seen. It's interesting, he said, during the fake Jussie Smollett attack, remember we talked about that so often, he says all sorts of people from Al Sharpton to Kamala Harris immediately issued warnings about so-called systemic white racism that had reared its ugly head to victimize Jussie Smollett. Of course, as we know, even at the time, there's pretty good evidence that the police had doubts about this, given the fact that you were out at 2 a.m. when it was below zero and you were going to a subway. I mean, there were just a lot of questions that surfaced almost immediately about that as well. And it turns out, as we have found out, that he concocted, as he says, the whole charade, even hired his own assaulters. And if anything, we can see what that did. But he reminds us that we've seen other times in which you've had demagoguery. He mentions the Tawana Brawley rape, the Duke lacrosse charade, the Covington kids ruse, the Michael Ford, I think it was the other Ford, hands up, don't shoot fabrication, and a variety of others. And so, again, those all were one of the examples of how when it was the other way, even though in many cases was fake or a charade, he mentions Michael Ford, I think he mentions George Ford, but anyway, we'll continue on from that. But again, radicalists often concoct white racist attackers, go silent when the evidence proves fabricated, only to be primed for the next hoax. Then number 5, he says, and this is now broadening the look, the media and authorities did their best to either hide or downplay the violence. Some of you that only watch mainstream media maybe have never seen this particular video, although it's quite available on YouTube and a variety of other places. He says city leaders, the chief of police, the media variously blamed, and then we go through this long list, on social media, the original one-on-one dispute, alcohol, the lack of civilian intervention to stop the violence, a festival atmosphere, anything from the fact that these were black youth wanting to pummel into unconsciousness white individuals. Then he goes on to say, number 6, had a gang of white toughs beat middle-aged African Americans senseless, recorded it, and cheered on the violence. Of course, we know the reaction. There would be an immediate outrage, and we would be, for probably months, subjected to all sorts of evaluation there as well. And then number 7, he says, the quiet of the left-wing media to the reprehensible violence stands in marked contrast to their usual rush to judgment radicalism in 2 nearly simultaneous incidents. For example, he talks about when a mixed African American entered into corporate headquarters, killed 4 individuals, and CNN falsely said it was a white male, and gives a couple other examples of that as well. So he ends by reminding us that when it came time for the media to jump on something, it wasn't what happened in the streets of Cincinnati. It happened in an advertisement which involved actress and model Sydney Sweeney, who had cut a jeans commercial in front of a poster that said, Sydney Sweeney has great genes, with jeans crossed out with a G and jeans with a J. And the left exploded, saying that this was a reference to white eugenics. Now, let me give credit to Victor Davis Hanson, because almost everybody seems to think that eugenics came from Adolf Hitler. Matter of fact, if you watch the Babylon Bee, they now have a picture of Adolf Hitler in jeans commercial, so obviously that is not the case. But he reminds us that this idea of eugenics really goes back to Margaret Sanger and even to the Democratic President Woodrow Wilson. Well, I'm doing one better. If you go and look at who was the honorary president of the Eugenics Society in Britain, it was Francis Galton. Who's Francis Galton? He was the cousin of Charles Darwin. Later on, the son of Charles Darwin, Leonard Darwin, was the president of the Eugenics Society. Long before Margaret Sanger knew much about eugenics, long before Woodrow Wilson had even heard the phrase eugenics, that goes all the way back to Charles Darwin. And, interestingly enough, not so much in Origin of Species, but in his later book. And most people aren't aware of that. We maybe need to do just one whole program here on racism, eugenics, and evolution, because that's really where those ideas come from. But anyway, he goes on to talk about the fact that we have these double standards and also all sorts of racial fixations. But nevertheless, a good piece to remind us that one of the very troubling videos to watch right now is the beatdown that took place in the streets of Cincinnati, and the sad way in which it was poorly covered by the media at a time when the media almost lost its mind over the American Eagle jeans commercial. But that is the world we find ourselves in. First of all, I want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. We'll see you tomorrow here with June Hunt, right here on Point of View.
You already know that Point of View relies on people like you, listeners, to stay on the air. And here's something that you might not know. Only 1% of Point of View's listening audience currently gives. You heard that right, just 1%. But we've done the math, and if every listener, including you, gave just $10, that would be enough to fund Point of View for an entire year. So here is my challenge to you. If you have never given before, please spare $10 to help keep truth on the air. Your support will fund the daily broadcast as well as additional resources that equip listeners to apply God's truth in their own lives. In short, Americans need Point of View, and we need you. Give your $10 online at pointofview.net. Or you can give by calling toll-free 1-800-347-3776. 800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.